Once upon a mundane morning, Barb's day got busy without warning. A realtor in need of an open house sign. No, 50 of them, and designed before 9.
My head hurts.
Any mighty tools to help with this plight? Aha! Barb made her move. She opened Canva and got in the groove.
Bulk creating Canva sheets. Create 50 signs fit for suburban streets.
Done in a click, all complete.
Sweet!
Now, imagine what your dreams can become when you put imagination to work at canva.com.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Commercial Insurance. Business owners, meet Progressive Insurance. They make it easy to get discounts on commercial auto insurance and find coverages to grow with your business. Quote in as little as 8 minutes at progressivecommercial.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company. Coverage provided and serviced by affiliated and third-party insurers. Discounts and coverage selections not available in all states or situations.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 57 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. In 1789, Benjamin Franklin said, quote, "Our new Constitution is now established. Everything seems to promise it will be durable, but in this world, nothing is certain except death and taxes," end quote. This quote is very appropriate for today because today we're going to explore taxes and the creation of the early American fiscal system with Max Edling, professor of history at King's College and the author of A Hercules in the Cradle, War, Money, and the American State, 1783 to 1867. During our conversation, Max reveals the different fiscal powers of both the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution of 1787, the types of taxes early Americans paid and how they paid them, and the evolution of the United States' fiscal system and how it financed war and the territorial expansion of the early United States. But first, Happy Thanksgiving! During this period of thanks, I wanted you to know that I'm grateful and thankful for you. I am truly honored and grateful that each week you choose to spend your time with me exploring early American history. And I don't know about you, but I've just had so much fun doing it, and I really hope that you have too. So thank you for spending your time with me, and I really hope that you and your family enjoy this wonderful holiday. Now, without further ado, allow me to introduce you to our guest historian.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest today is a professor of history at King's College London and a native of Stockholm, Sweden. His research interests include state formation and public finance in the early American Republic. He has published numerous articles in both English and Swedish, and he has published 2 books, A Revolution in Favor of Government, Origins of the U.S. Constitution and the Making of the American State, and, most recently, A Hercules in the Cradle, War, Money, and the American State, 1783 to 1867. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Max Edling.
Thank you, Liz. It's great to be with you.
Max, I'm curious. How did you come by your interest in early American history? Do they teach early American history in Sweden?
That is a good question. So, no, there's virtually no teaching in American history either in school or at university. Although, of course, once you get to the second half of the 20th century in history, then inevitably the U.S. does play a major role. But in terms of the early period, they teach us very little. So a little bit about the Revolution and a little bit about the Civil War, and that's about it. So I probably shouldn't tell you this or your listeners this, but I've actually never studied American history other than on my own. So it's a little strange maybe that I did get into early American history, and I did that through political science rather than history. I was a graduate in political science in Stockholm, and in Europe, in contrast to the US, political science is a field that looks much more like modern political history, I guess, compared to what it would look like in a poli-sci department in the US. So what I wanted to do was take a look at these broad political transformations that happened in the age of revolutions. And my original idea was that I'd start with the American Revolution and I'd then move on to the French Revolution. But instead, I got stuck, and I've been stuck ever since, I guess, and haven't got to the French Revolution yet.
I have a similar story. I started reading about early American history from the beginning, and I got stuck in the Revolution, and I haven't made it out either.
Yeah, happens to us all.
I find it interesting that they don't even teach the history of New Sweden in Sweden, because there was that briefly lived colony in what became the United States of New Sweden.
Sure, true. You'd probably get half a page or a picture and a picture caption or something like that, but hardly more than that. And there's really no new research into New Sweden by professional historians either these days. It might change in the future, I don't know, but it certainly wasn't the case when I attended university.
Let's move into our discussion of war, money, and the American state. In A Hercules in the Cradle, Max explores how the United States expanded west with its ability to finance and muster the coercive means of war, or at least the threat of war. Max, would you provide us with an overview of how and when the United States acquired its ability to finance war and its territorial expansion?
Okay, the argument of the book is actually very simple, and I think I can summarize it in 3 words. That is that money equals power. So to do anything, really, a government has to have the money to pay for whatever it does, and this is something that is universal. It takes place everywhere. Today, governments do all kinds of things. So they pay for infrastructure, they subsidize education, they subsidize healthcare, they try to stimulate the economy. They do many different things. But back in the 18th century, central governments were really focused on just a couple of things, and chief among them would be war and foreign policy. And one of the main themes in 19th century American history is, of course, territorial expansion. And this enormous growth of the U.S. is such a familiar story that I think we tend to take it almost for granted. It's as if it just had to happen. But what I argue in the book is that this territorial expansion actually happened because of the activities of the federal government. So the U.S. grew because the federal government acquired a new territory by purchase, in the case of Louisiana, Florida, and Alaska, for example, or by annexation, in the case of Texas, by war of conquest, in the case of the Southwest, and by negotiation, in the case of the Pacific Northwest. And when it comes to the Native Americans and acquiring land from the Native Americans, the federal government really used all of these different measures: purchase, war, and negotiations. All of these things cost money, obviously. Territorial purchase cost quite a bit, but war cost much, much more. So for this reason, the ability of the United States to grow really rested on the ability of the federal government to find the money that would allow it to buy territory or to pay for war or to pay for the military, to pay for the Navy, to pay for diverse Indian agents and things like that. All of this might seem or sound quite easy or straightforward, but if we look back at American history, it is clear that taxes have never really been popular in the U.S., and things like public debts have always been highly criticized. And if we go outside the U.S., we can see that many governments struggle to make ends meet, and this is true, I think, not least of nations that used to be called the developing world. They often face enormous problems having to do with public finance, having to do with finding tax money and to pay interest on their debts and things like that. So in the case of the U.S., I think we really need to remember that the United States is the first modern nation created through a colonial independence struggle. And historically, that type of nation, the nations that go through this transition from colonial rule to independence, have almost always had enormous problems getting their financial house in order. And what is remarkable about the United States is that the U.S. managed to get the fiscal system and its public credit in order very, very quickly after independence. And I think this is, in comparative perspective, pretty remarkable achievement, really. And obviously, if money equals power, then this ability of the federal government to raise money through taxes and through loans made it relatively powerful, at least in a North American context. It meant that it could take advantage of opportunities that arose in North America to become the dominant power on the continent in the course of the 19th century.
Today, we take it for granted that the United States has the power to raise money, but that really wasn't always the case. Max, would you tell us about the Articles of Confederation and how the Constitution remedied its problems with regards to requisitioning money from the states?
Yeah, so requisition was the method in place before the adoption of the Constitution, and it meant that instead of Congress taxing the people, Congress asked the states to contribute money so that the states taxed the people on behalf of Congress. And when this system was created, when the Articles of Confederation were drafted in 1777, it was a system that made a lot of sense. After all, Americans were rebelling against the British Parliament and the claim of the British Parliament that they had a right to impose taxes on the colonies. So obviously, control over taxation was important, and such control really should stay close to the American people, and there was no way that the states were going to give it up to a distant Congress. If they had been willing to do that, then they might as well have given in to the demands of the British Parliament. So what happened was that under the Articles of Confederation, Congress had the power to spend money and to borrow money, but it didn't have the power to tax. And it soon became obvious that this was a system that didn't work that well in practice. Congress started out paying for the War of Independence by printing millions and millions of paper dollars. And this sounds bad, but it really wasn't as bad as it might at first seem. It was a system that could well have worked if only the money that was printed and paid out was taxed in at the same pace as it was paid out. But what happened instead was that at first the states didn't tax at all, and when they started to tax, they didn't tax enough. They didn't tax the same amounts either. So the result of all this was that there were these conflicts between the states about whether or not they had contributed their fair share to the common cause. And meanwhile, Congress was receiving very little money from these requisitions. So to give you one example, in the 6 months before the Constitutional Convention met, Congress got less than $700 to meet current expenses, and this simply wasn't enough. So when the Constitutional Convention met, there were actually people in the convention who wanted to continue this system of requisitions, but the majority did not. They thought that the record had made it clear that requisitions simply didn't work. So the only realistic alternative was to transfer power over taxation from the states to Congress so that the Congress could tax the American people directly. And there had in fact been several attempts to do this before the convention met in the 1780s, and they had all failed, but they had failed pretty narrowly. So in the summer of 1787, there was a fairly widespread acceptance of this idea that Congress should have the right to levy at least some taxes independently of the states. What happened in the convention, and where the convention went beyond expectations, was that it granted Congress, the new federal government, much broader powers over taxation than anyone had thought that would be necessary. So there were some restrictions. The federal government under the Constitution can't tax exports, and originally any property taxes needed to be proportioned to state populations. But to critics, it seemed that the new fiscal powers of Congress really were unlimited. And the framers, the defenders of the Constitution, defended this much broader grant of fiscal powers with a fairly simple and straightforward argument. So they said that the federal government was created to promote and defend the interest and independence of the United States. And there was simply no way you could estimate how much this would cost. War, for example, could cost anything. It cost an enormous amount. And for this reason, you couldn't really limit the power of the government to raise the money it needed to do what it had to do. So what they said, in short, was that the government's means had to be commensurate to its ends. That's how they put it.
When many of us think of the early United States and trying to establish the new government under the Constitution, we think of Alexander Hamilton. What role did Hamilton play in establishing the fiscal system that the first Congress would implement?
Well, he was obviously important because he was the first Treasury Secretary. I personally am a little skeptical about the tendency to hero worship when it comes to the founders. So I'd say that, he did a very important job, but I don't think that he was in any way unique, and I think that other people could have done what he did. But having said that, what the first Congress did, even more than Hamilton, I guess, was extremely important to the development of the U.S. because they took this old requisition system and transformed it into a new system and thereby reformed the American fiscal regime completely. They took a system that didn't work and replaced it with one that worked quite well. In the old system, there had been a lot of aggravation, but very little money. The new system was productive, and it didn't really cause hardship or create any kinds of serious protests. Under the old system, the state governments collected all the money. Under the new system, the federal government collected almost all the money. And whereas the old system mostly taxed people, what was called poll taxes, and property, the new system relied almost exclusively on input duties instead. And there are two really important consequences of this reform. The first, and the most obvious one, is that the federal government now had the money it needed to pay for things like an army and a diplomatic establishment, and it now had the money to pay interest on the public debt. The second thing, which is less obvious maybe, was that this new system put an end to the hardship caused by the previous tax system, which had given rise to quite a bit of political turbulence and social unrest. So I've just said that the requisition system didn't work, it didn't produce any money, but things were actually worse than this because the states tried to make it work but failed. And when they tried to tax the people, they caused real hardship. And as a consequence of this hardship, there were a lot of protests against state taxation in the 1780s. And most of this was peaceful, but sometimes it was violent. And in Massachusetts, there was a very famous tax rebellion called Chase's Rebellion. If you only look at what the states tried to do, this looks a little strange because taxes actually weren't that high and Americans were fairly well off. So why were taxes difficult to pay? And to understand this, you need to know that early America was a credit-based economy. And this meant that if you were a farmer, for example, you could be quite wealthy in the sense that you could own land and livestock and buildings. You could also sell your crops in the marketplace, and you could buy stuff that you couldn't produce on your farm. You could do all of this without actually touching any real physical money in the shape of gold or silver coins. It was all done based on credit. So when the tax collector came to collect even pretty modest sums in gold and silver coins, it could be very, very hard for ordinary taxpayers to find this money to pay taxes with. And at the time in the 1780s, there was an economic depression, and being forced to sell property at auction, which is what would happen if you couldn't pay your taxes, meant a considerable economic loss. So to many taxpayers, these taxes did seem a real threat to their livelihood and even to their independence. So what Hamilton and the first Congress did was really replace these taxes on polls and property levied by the states with customs duties that were levied by the federal government. And this made a big change. It was not the case that impost duties on import in any sense were fairer than land taxes, for example. In fact, many duties fell on things that poor people and middling people used just as much as the rich people did. But it was a system that was much easier to administer because now the tax collectors would no longer demand money from cash-starved farmers. They would instead turn to importing merchants. And importing merchants were people who had typically ready access to money. We shouldn't think that this means that it was the merchants who paid for the federal government, because the merchants actually passed the duty on to the consumers by raising the price of the goods they were selling. But it did mean that the administration of taxes when using customs duties was much, much smoother than other forms of taxation. So no need for coercion, no need for auctions or anything like that.
It's kind of like a sleight of hand or an ingenious tactic that they used, because they went from a system of direct taxation with poll and property taxes, where the tax was direct, to a system of indirect taxes where you'd pay it on the goods that you imported, but the tax was included in the price you would pay. So it's like you're paying taxes without thinking about paying taxes.
Yes, absolutely. And this was one of the advantages too. If an argument often made that people didn't notice paying taxes, that was one thing. And the other big thing was that if they didn't like to pay taxes, they simply didn't have to buy the item that was taxed. And this argument makes sense as long as you tax only certain things that you can go without. But if in reality, with the tax on things like salt, in that society, there was no chance you could choose not to pay that tax.
You mentioned that early America was a credit-based economy. How did early Americans pay their taxes? Because throughout the colonial period and into that early republic, they're cash-poor country. They just don't have cash in circulation. So how do you pay the tax man?
Well, for these direct taxes, farmers would typically pay cash in hand directly, whereas merchants would pay the customs collectors, and these kinds of transactions would normally go through banks where both would have accounts. What's interesting about the old tax system in places like early America, but also in Britain and in most European places too, was that it was always localized when it came to these direct taxes on things like land. And the reason for this was that the early modern state couldn't really assess property in any good way. So this was left to the local communities to do on their own. So there was this self-assessment where essentially a local community like a township would be responsible for paying a certain sum, and that sum would be divided among the inhabitants in the local community based on how rich they were, so they would pay proportionate to their wealth. And the community would then make a self-assessment, or everyone would make a self-assessment. But obviously, because the system looked the way it did, it was in everyone's interest to make sure that this self-assessment was fairly accurate. If you were dodging your tax, it would directly affect the tax bill of your neighbor, which is obviously different from today.
If we think back to our history classes, another aspect of the establishment of the early American fiscal state is Alexander Hamilton's debt assumption plan. That plan that he takes Jefferson and Madison into a back room and negotiates congressional votes to pass in exchange for Washington, D.C. becoming the capital of the United States. Would you tell us about this debt assumption plan and how it helped the United States manage its debts?
So again, like with the fiscal reform, I think what Hamilton did was clever, and he was the man in charge, but he was following precedents that had been laid down by others. And in some ways, you can say that what he did was simply take English practices of public finance to the U.S., much in the same way that William of Orange had brought Dutch public financial practices to England 100 years earlier. The assumption of the state debts was really part of a broader package of reforms. And Hamilton, when he became Treasury Secretary, was faced by this huge outstanding debt to foreign and domestic creditors. And he knew that the expected income that he could count on from things like customs duties wouldn't nearly be enough to pay interest on this debt, and it certainly wouldn't be enough to pay the principal. And Hamilton thought, wrongly as things turned out, that this income wouldn't grow in the near future anyway, or at least not grow very much. So in that situation, what he could have done was advocate that default, simply declare bankruptcy, which would have made all the debts void. And this is something that all sovereign states can do if they want to. But it is an option that comes with consequences, because once you've proved that you're not a reliable borrower, it's going to be pretty hard to convince people to trust you with their money again. And to Hamilton, it was really crucial that the U.S. government would be able to borrow in the future. And his reason for this has to do with war again. In the 18th century, it had long been an established truth that money is the sinews of war. What was quite new in the 18th century was that money came from long-term borrowing. And this shift to a new type of paying for war began in Europe in the 17th century and was well established by the end of the 18th century. European states paid for war by selling long-term bonds to private investors, and they could do that either to investors in their own countries, or they could do it to foreign nationals, so selling their bonds on markets abroad, and that would happen chiefly in Amsterdam in the late 18th century. If a state wasn't able to do this, it was soon going to find itself in considerable trouble because it wouldn't be able to defend itself against other states. So really the starting point for Hamilton's reforms was to make sure that the U.S. would have this ability to borrow in times of international crisis. And when he became chief of the Treasury, this was not possible because the U.S. had mismanaged its debt for a long time and its credit rating was absolutely zero, so no chance of borrowing money from anyone. What he had to do was try somehow to restore the credit rating of the federal government. There's only one way to do this, and that was to make sure that the government started to pay its public creditors. But, as I said, the government's income was not big enough for this, and Hamilton didn't think that he could increase the income very much. So what he decided to do instead was cut the cost of the loan. And he did this first by saying that all the outstanding debt consisted of perpetual bonds, and this meant that the government would pay only the interest on the bonds, and it would make no commitment to repaying the principal. And this is similar to what you have today, at least in some countries, called interest-only mortgages. And this is something that reduces your annual cost of debt servicing considerably. So Hamilton did that. And the second thing that he did was renegotiate the interest rate. So he brought it down from 6% to a little more than 4%, which also cut the cost of the loan further. When he did this, he was imposing a unilateral change of the loan terms, and he could well be accused of, and he was in fact accused of expropriating private property and doing something quite similar to defaulting on the loans. And if this reform was going to work, it was important for him that the creditors came in voluntarily and accepted the changes that he proposed, and this required convincing the creditors that it was actually in their best interest to accept the new terms. And Hamilton was successful here. He made the creditors see that with the new terms, they would at least get something. They would get 4% interest paid in silver coin, whereas before they had nothing. They had worthless bonds, and these bonds earned only equally worthless interest in the form of new bits of paper issued by the government. In fact, as things turned out, the creditors did get a pretty good deal because their bonds rose in value very quickly. And the fact that Hamilton made money for the public creditors in this way is something that's always been very controversial among historians, and perhaps this is rightly so. What I'm interested in, though, in this book is what the government got out of Hamilton's reforms. And this is quite easy to answer, because from the time of Hamilton's reforms in the 1790s, 1791, the U.S. government has always been able to finance extraordinary costs, such as war, by borrowing money against long-term bonds.
It sounds like that by 1800, the United States is well on its way to having a sound fiscal policy. But we also know that in 1801, Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans come to power. Would you tell us about Jefferson's Treasury Secretary, Albert Gallatin, and how the Democratic Republicans shaped early American fiscal policy?
First of all, Gallatin, just like Hamilton, was an immigrant. But whereas Hamilton came from the West Indies before the Revolution, Gallatin came from Switzerland at the very end of the War of Independence. And whereas Hamilton was a soldier, Gallatin really hated war in all forms. He started his political career as a congressman in the mid-1790s. And he soon became close to Jefferson and Madison and became the main critic of Federalist management of the public finances. And when Jefferson became president in 1801, Gallatin became his Treasury Secretary, and he then continued to serve throughout both terms and also under James Madison. And Gallatin left office officially in 1814, and this means that he remains, in fact, the longest-serving Treasury Secretary in U.S. history. Now, I contrasted Gallatin to Hamilton on purpose because historians typically think of these people as polar opposites in terms of the way they handled the nation's finances, which makes sense, I guess, because they were political enemies. But looking at what Gallatin did in office, this is not at all true. There's actually much more continuity and then change when Gallatin takes over from the Federalists. So, like Hamilton, Gallatin tried to keep the taxes low. Like Hamilton, Gallatin took great care of the public debt. Like Hamilton, Gallatin kept and supported the Bank of the United States. He kept the most important parts of the Hamiltonian system. And just like Hamilton, Gallatin knew how important it was for a state to be able to borrow to pay for war. And he certainly knew that if Jefferson would start to try and manipulate the public debt, this would risk public credit, and it might not be possible for the federal government to borrow in the future. So I really think that in the history of public finance, one of the most important things that Gallatin and Jefferson did was that they accepted and worked with the Hamiltonian system and didn't try to change it. In some areas like fiscal policy, Gallatin really wasn't much of an innovator. He supported Jefferson in getting rid of all taxes except customs duties. These other taxes hadn't really been very important in terms of the income they brought into the Treasury, but some people like Hamilton thought that as the U.S. economy would expand and grow, these taxes on sales and on domestic production would become more and more important. But Jefferson and Gallatin wanted to have nothing like this in the fiscal system of the nation. And this became a permanent legacy of Gallatin's time in the Treasury. So up until the Civil War, the federal government never relied on anything but customs duties in peacetime. There was an obvious drawback in doing this because if American trade for some reason would go down, the federal government would see its income shrink. And if you are inhabiting a world that is economically dominated by Atlantic trade and politically dominated by European maritime great powers, this obviously is a fiscal system that makes the United States vulnerable to what's going on outside, in the outside world. So if war happened with Britain or with France, these nations would only have to blockade U.S. ports to cause real problems for the federal government. So this slimmed down fiscal system was in some ways also a very, very dangerous measure if we look at international politics.
And of course, war did come in 1812. The War of 1812 marks another watershed moment or turning point in the U.S.'s coming of age in its fiscal policy. In A Hercules in a Cradle, Max explains how the War of 1812 marked the first attempt by the United States government to finance a war using long-term securities. This method of finance became the model by which the United States has funded all subsequent wars. Max, would you tell us about the challenges of funding the War of 1812 and how the Treasury Department came by its idea to fund it using long-term securities? And it would also probably help us if you told us what long-term securities are.
Sure. So long-term securities or long-term bonds is really what governments use these days too. It's simply a promise by the government that is going to repay the bond after a certain time, and up until it repays the bond, it's going to pay interest on the bond, which in the U.S. case in the War of 1812 and previously meant that they would pay an interest rate of 6% typically. There's no big mystery why Gallatin decided on this way of funding the War of 1812. This was made possible thanks to Hamilton's reforms, and it was generally considered to be the best possible way of financing the war, in the sense that it was the most efficient way in raising money, and also in the sense that it would cause the least disturbance. You would be able to raise quite a lot of money through loans without having to raise a lot of taxes. So essentially, Gallatin used the system he had inherited from Hamilton to find the War of 1812. The big challenge to him was that the war cost so much more than anyone had expected. And his second problem was the fiscal system that he had himself created meant that as soon as Britain started to attack American trade, the income from customs duties dropped sharply. Congress wasn't a big help either. Congress refused to follow his recommendations to impose new taxes and to increase existing taxes. This is something he started arguing for well before war broke out, but Congress didn't listen. The second thing where Congress didn't help was that Gallatin wanted Congress to recharter the Bank of the United States as a much, much bigger bank than the first one. And this new bank would have been able, in Gallatin's plan, to lend the government a lot of money in the case of war. So his problem, as the war continued, was that there wasn't, or the government's problem was that there wasn't enough money coming into the treasury, and this made loans seem more and more risky as the war went on. And when loans seem risky to investors, it means that the cost of borrowing goes up. So loans become more and more expensive. And things became so bad. By 1814, the government actually had to abandon this system and instead turn to something called short-term treasury notes, which was a one-year kind of bond that they issued. It is something of an open question, I think, if the U.S. had been able to keep up the war, if the British had decided to go on into 1815. On the one hand, the financial situation was really desperate by the fall of 1814. But on the other hand, by then Congress had finally decided to introduce a comprehensive tax program, and congressmen were also discussing creating a new big central bank. So possibly these changes would have meant that enough money would have come into the Treasury so that they could start issuing these long-term bonds again. But as we all know, the test never came. Instead, we got peace on Christmas Eve of 1814, and as soon as Congress heard about this, they started dismantling all of its war measures.
The War of 1812 helped the United States figure out how to effectively finance war. At the start of our conversation, I mentioned how in A Hercules in the Cradle, Max explores how the United States expanded west with its ability to finance and muster the coercive means of war. Max, would you provide us with a brief overview of the Mexican-American War, which took place between 1846 and 1848, and how the United States government applied the lessons that it learned during the War of 1812 to its war with Mexico?
Well, compared to the War of 1812, there's really very little drama when it comes to the funding of the Mexican War, at least on the U.S. side. There's quite a lot of drama on the Mexican side. It proved to be really easy to pay for this war, and the Treasury Secretary, Robert J. Walker, was in fact involved in doing a lot of other things in public finance, other major reforms in public finance, much more than he was involved in finding the money to pursue the war. Like the previous conflict, when the Mexican War broke out, the administration thought that this was going to be a brief affair. Polk, who was president during the war, had clear but fairly limited war objectives. His problem was that the Mexican government refused to give in, and the U.S. had to apply more and more pressure, and in the end it required the occupation of Mexico City and of the territory north of the capital to force the Mexican government to surrender and accept Polk's peace terms. Because the war dragged on and became more extensive, then it meant that it came to cost a lot more than anyone had thought at first. Polk and Walker, like a lot of the political leaders in the Jeffersonian, Jacksonian tradition, were convinced opponents of public debts, and for that reason they actually didn't want to create a long-term debt at first. They hoped to be able to issue these one-year treasury notes instead, which hopefully they would be able to pay off a lot sooner than the time it would take to pay a long-term bond. But this didn't work out, and in the end, Walker had to issue these long-term bonds. The method was similar to during the War of 1812. The government sold these bonds by auction, so people submitted sealed bids saying how many bonds they wanted and what they were willing to pay for them. And the government sold its bonds to the highest bidder. In the War of 1812, things were bad, and the government had to sell its bonds at a discount. During the Mexican War, the financial situation was so good that the government could sell its bonds with a small profit instead. It certainly helped that the economy had developed so that there were investment bankers who could market the bonds and who could make sure that there was enough demand and interest in the loans. And another thing that was really important and was different from the War of 1812 was that obviously this was a land war, and Mexico didn't have a navy and couldn't attack American trade. So all this income from customs duties continued to flow into the treasury throughout the war. So it proved to be a very easy thing to finance this war compared to the War of 1812.
Let's transition to the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In A Hercules in the Cradle, Max mentions that the French Revolutionary Wars, which took place between 1793 and 1807, allowed for the steady and quick growth of the United States economy. Max, in your opinion, what might have happened to the United States' economy and its growth if France had not had its revolution?
That's a tough question. It is clear that American merchants made a lot of money in the Atlantic trade thanks to the war, thanks to being able to be neutral carriers of stuff that France and Britain had carried before. So some historians have argued that they used this money that they earned for productive investments, and that this investment kick-started the U.S. economy and got the nation out of this big depression that happened after the War of Independence. So presumably, had there not been a French Revolution, this development would have been at least postponed. So that's one possible answer, but I'm not really an economic historian. I'm a political historian writing about the power of money. So I think I'm going to answer your question slightly differently. And it seems to me that the big thing about the French Revolution is that it created contingencies that the United States was quick to benefit from, and that it could benefit from thanks to having relatively stable and efficient governmental institutions. So without the French Revolution, there wouldn't have been a Haitian Revolution. Without the Haitian Revolution, you wouldn't have had this disastrous French expedition to regain control of the island. And without the disastrous French military expedition, you wouldn't have had the Louisiana Purchase. Without the Louisiana Purchase, U.S. history and U.S. economic development would have turned out very differently. Another thing that happens as a result of the French Revolution is the French invasion of Spain that happens in 1808. Without this invasion of Spain, I don't think you would have had Latin American independence. If you hadn't had Latin American independence, there would have been no independent Mexico. And if it would have been Spain rather than Mexico that was in control of California and the Southwest, I don't think it's as likely that the U.S. would have been able to conquer these areas, the Southwest and California. And without California and Texas, obviously, the U.S. would have had no Texan oil fields, no Hollywood, no Silicon Valley. And without these things, then clearly the American economy would have looked very, very differently. So I guess my answer is that without the French Revolution, quite a lot of things that happened in U.S. history would not have happened, and that this had a huge impact also on the economic development. So possibly I should have picked the French Revolution rather than the American Revolution, come to think of it, when I decided on my scholarly career all these years ago.
I guess it's a good thing for the United States that France had its revolution.
Yes, it certainly is. Certainly, very much so.
Before we conclude, would you tell us about your current research project? Are you still stuck in the American Revolution and the early American state?
I am indeed. I think I'll be stuck there for the rest of my career, to be honest. So this new project that I'm working on, if I put it very simply, takes issue with an idea that I think is still common, namely that the U.S. was created as the first liberal nation. And perhaps I should explain that liberal means liberal in the original sense of the word, so as in liberal democracy and universal citizenship and popular sovereignty. It doesn't mean lefty or intellectual, which is, I think, how many political commentators in the U.S. use the term these days. What I want to argue in this new project is that the polity created by the Founding Fathers in 1787, in fact, has much more in common with early modern empires than it has with modern liberal democracies. So you can say that the liberal nation is characterized by universal rights and universal equality, and what I call the American Republican Empire, in contrast, was characterized by diversity, hierarchy, and inequality. It might sound a little technical at the moment because I'm only just starting, but I think in the end it's going to be pretty good.
Where is the best place to look for more information about you and how to get in contact with you if we still have some questions?
That would be the King's College London website, which has contact information for me and also links to all my publications.
Max, thank you so much for helping us better understand how money equals power in the early American Republic.
Oh, it's been my pleasure entirely, and thanks very much for having me on the show.
We may be 200 and 300 years removed from our early American forebears, but do you know what we have in common with them? Taxes. As Benjamin Franklin noted in 1789, nothing is certain but death and taxes. Given the certainty of taxes, it seems important that we understand how the United States' fiscal system has evolved. As Max revealed today, the United States' fiscal system started with the requisition system of the Articles of Confederation government. Now, this method of raising revenue did not work, so the framers of the Constitution devised another system, a system that the people of the United States approved of when they ratified the Constitution in 1789. Now, since 1789, the United States government has tweaked its ability to raise revenue. By the Mexican-American War in the 1840s, the United States had developed an efficient system of taxation and revenue generation, a system that Americans continued to adapt as war and territorial expansion required. You can find more information about Max, his book, A Hercules in the Cradle, plus everything we talked about today on the show notes page for this episode, benfranklinsworld.com/057. Now, there's a lot of great content in the show notes, and the easiest way to access them is to text BFWorld to 33444. This action will allow you to subscribe to the Franklin Gazette, which is a weekly newsletter that delivers the show notes right to your inbox. Talk about convenience, right? Also, by signing up for the Franklin Gazette, you'll receive the information you need to join Poor Richard's Club, a social community for history lovers on Facebook. We have a ton of fun in Poor Richard's Club, so I hope you'll consider joining us, and I hope to see you there. If you enjoy Ben Franklin's World, please text Support BF World to 33444, or visit benfranklinsworld.com/movement to find out more about how you can join the Ben Franklin's World movement and help support the show. Finally, the next time the United States overhauls its fiscal system, do you think that a system of indirect taxes or direct taxes would be better? Tweet me at Liz Covart or post a comment on the show notes page for this episode or in Poor Richard's Club.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.